Thank you so much. My name is Dmitry Grozubinski, and disaster strikes in the first 3 seconds. ODI truly,
Done.
yeah, that's going to be the high point of the session. My name is Dmitry Grozubinski. I'm the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform. Thank you so much to Jody and to all of you for having me here. It is my job to conduct our second absolutely star-studded panel, which has been given the grandiose name of The New Landscape of Trade-Related Economic Diplomacy, Security, Defense, and Development, but which I view as a kind of a chance to take a half step back and really do a stock take of what is actually happening, how that has changed from where we were before in terms of how governments are using trade policy and how that use of trade policy in more dynamic ways is actually manifesting on the ground for businesses and for policymakers trying to chart a path forward. And then to examine both some specific cases and a potential path forward. So let me begin by introducing our panel. Here in person with us, in no particular order, we have David Hennig, the Director of UK Trade Policy Project, who needs no introduction here. We have ODI's own Max Mendes-Parra, the Principal Research Fellow here at ODI Global. We have Agnes Gittal, of Managing Partner at GBS Africa, and also double hatting as Executive Director of the East Africa Association. Welcome. We have my old friend Tawfiq Rahman, the Director of the Development Division of the World Trade Organization, who has a lot to think about these days, and maybe regretting his promotion. And we have Professor Mona Poulsen, who is Assistant Professor of Law at LSE, who you may have heard ask a question before. And online, hopefully you can join us, looming over us all like the vengeful god of an unlabored axis on a chart, is Professor Simon Evanet, a Professor of Geopolitics and Strategy at IMD, or the International Institute for Management and Development. So what I'd like to do today is begin by sort of starting global and large, and then zoom on down into some of the specifics, both in terms of the data and in terms of regions and business impact, before taking a step back and looking at possible paths forward. So we're going to be zooming in, zooming out, sort of careening all over the place. And to begin our careening, I'd like to hand the floor to David Hennig. David, you've written a number of pieces kind of broadly looking at the geopolitics of it all, and specifically the changes to how governments are using trade diplomacy. I use governments with a plural, but perhaps one specific government more than others. So I wonder if you could sort of lay the scene for us while I stand here awkwardly and stare at you.
Thank you, Dimitri. It's a pleasure to have you as our moderator, someone who has literally written the book on this. And I will try to do this whilst being slightly scared that Simon will sort of come out of the screen behind me and sort of, if I talk out of turn. Look, I was going to talk about the political rhetoric of deglobalization, which is undoubtedly there, and we're seeing lots of an increased number of national measures, the protectionist or rule breaking that Simon is tracking so diligently, from actual trade flows, which continue strongly, are likely to do so. And as we were hearing in the first session, there are all manner of regional initiatives still ongoing. And I suppose the top line point is, and this is really counter to the political narrative that we hear all the time, certainly in Europe, creating the WTO didn't cause globalization, and fragmenting rules won't break globalization. They will change it, however. Yeah, why is that? My work focuses on the technology causes of globalization that make it easier than ever for goods, services, money, and people to cross borders, and governments increasingly trying to stop or control some of those flows, whether in the name of control or of economic security. Now, what we see from the Trump administration, as you referred to, the one that is most trying to break globalization, But it's an extreme form of what we also see from the EU. This is the view that wins me no friends in Brussels, of weaponization or stretching the rules or simply breaking them. And some of this is based on seeing global trade as somehow unnatural, particularly if we're not the ones setting the rules or we're not dominating it in the case of Europe and North America. What's the impact of this? It's to the advantage of the largest companies and countries and disadvantages the smallest as well as consumers, is the extension of this. Because most trade, we can argue exactly the definition, takes place in some ways in global value chains run by the largest organizations. They have the ability and money to work around the restrictions, or frankly, in some cases, simple bribery is doing the job in the US, and the extra cost of production and therefore the extra for them of tariffs, for example, from the US, is just a small part of their final price. If you take, for example, how much a Nike trainer costs to make compared to how much they're going to sell it for in the US, those are two very different numbers. And small companies really don't have that option. And to take my current favored example, the actual or proposed elimination of de minimis in the US or in the EU, which is targeted, let's face it, at two Chinese companies, Temu and Shein, who will probably find ways around it, whilst large numbers of small sellers will just stop selling internationally altogether. And that's really bad trade policy with negative economic consequences in further strengthening large incumbents against competition. But the same if happens from increased regulations or increased tariffs. So now there is a problem that countries are thinking about, that is a reasonable issue to be thinking about, which is national policy space against global flows. WTO GATT rules originally were designed to open markets. They're less able to talk about how you control globalization. Now it's been achieved. We have open markets, by and large, we have global markets. What can we do in the rules to control those? There is a problem there. And I think that leads us into a different space in than the standard WTO reform agenda, or the one about dispute settlement, or even the one about let's have a WTO e-commerce plurilateral. We've had eBay now for just over 30 years, so they seem to be managing without an e-commerce plurilateral. We are still seeing, in any case, various agreements. So I think we need that different conversation that starts with today's economy, and that does talk about balancing national interests against potentially controlling against particular countries and the impact that would have. Also about thinking about the interests of small companies and consumers, which is hardly thought about at all. And we need some kind of level playing field. And I want to finish on the issue of trust, because we haven't really heard about that. We're not discussing it enough. It's all very well having the rules, but in international law, sorry, Mona, you may disagree on this, the rules can only ever be partial. They only become meaningful if there's a level of trust between the parties that can turn those into actual operational trust, particularly for the smaller companies. And self-evidently, that doesn't apply at the moment. So it's rebuilding trust that I think is really important, along with this idea of managing the globalization that we have, that I think needs to take over from the existing conversation that we have in too many quarters about WTO reform, which strikes me as a rather stale agenda.
Thank you so much, David. I think three things jump out at me there and lead us nicely into Simon's presentation, but I think are just good general observations overall, and will forestall your inevitable tweet about how I wasn't listening while you were speaking. So first, I would say it's fascinating that you talk about the de minimis, because I think that is something that I think Simon will talk about a bit, in the sense that there you have a US-China conflict that is having impact on absolutely everyone else. A specific problem that the US and EU are having with high volume individual packages flooding in and essentially obviating a customs procedure are hitting thousands and thousands of businesses completely unrelated to the US conflict. I think another point you made there that I thought was really interesting was talking about the e-commerce rules and how often, I think this is a note for the trade policy community, we forget that we have to make a case for the value of rules and new agreements. As you said there, well, e-commerce is happening. And so often when we hear people make the case for something like the e-commerce JSI, what we hear is people say, we should have an e-commerce JSI because e-commerce is good. And they will proceed to list statistics about Temu or small sellers on Alibaba. But that's not a case for e-commerce rules being good. That's a case for e-commerce being good. And what are we doing to bridge that gap? And so I might leave it there and throw it to Simon Everett, who will hopefully appear on the screen above us once more. Oh, there he is. You're all around me, Simon. Simon, my set prompt to you was to talk through, to put some data behind some of the things that David was describing. But before you do that, I've been privileged to sit next to you on a number of panels last week and say, yes, what Simon said over and over again, which is my contribution. But you talk through quite a bit your future vision of a Fortress North America. So before you get to the data, could you just say a few words about where you see that going and explain that concept?
So thank you, Dimitri. And I'll flip my presentation and start where you want me to start, which was to ask, where do I see the trading system going next? And as security considerations dominate more and more of trade policy and investment policy, I have in mind, I think, about 4 different possible scenarios which I'm tracking. One of them is that the US retreats into some new version of the Monroe Doctrine, and therefore is interested in its own backyard much more than anything else. There have been hints at this in the newspapers in the last week or so. Again, there was a lot of hints of this at the end of last year. And a variant of that could involve Fortress North America. The elements of that we're beginning to see, recall the EV tariffs last year, which the Biden administration put in place in May, which Ottawa copied. And now it seems that Mexico has copied as well. Mexico has also put in place other measures. And so I think the USMCA renegotiation may well provide the opportunity to construct a Fortress North America with a high wall and then a lower wall around the rest of the Americas, where, of course, the intention is to diminish and, if not eliminate, as many ties with China as possible. So that is one particular scenario. The second scenario is that perhaps that China seeks an accommodation with the United States because of severe domestic economic troubles, and so tries to find some way of taking the pressure off and find some type of deal, not perhaps too different from the part 1 deal. The third scenario, since we're on the topic of scenarios, is that we have a transatlantic standoff continuing. And here I would expect to see this, under that scenario, the US and China being incapable of signing a deal which the Americans can sell at home. In some sense, the Trump team has a problem in that, having trashed the phase one deal which they negotiated, and having persuaded their base that China never honors deals, to then go and take one back to that same base will be particularly difficult. And you should just watch any interview on Fox News with any of the leading US trade officials or commerce secretary, and you'll see this tension comes to light. But that's still it is a possible outcome. And then, of course, the fourth outcome we have to consider is that the baton passes as China eclipses the United States as the hegemon. And given the way in which the United States is treating its allies at the moment, we cannot discount the possibility that a country of 360 million people cannot take on a country of 1.4 billion people over time. So these were, if you're looking forward, these would be different ways in which security and considerations might well end up providing a different backdrop to trade. I must say, of the ones which I've described, none of them are particularly conducive for a return to multilateral trade reform. And that's largely because many of the big players have effectively repudiated the ends and the means of trade deals in Geneva. As far as the ends are concerned, there's very little appetite for liberalization on an MFN basis by the big players against each other. And in terms of the means, which is binding trade agreements, it's pretty clear that the large sovereigns do not wish to be tied down by finicky rules and uppity judges who rule against them. So in that sense, our friends in Geneva have to find new configurations if binding trade accords are going to continue, or at least be negotiated anew, then I suspect it will have to be on a groupings or plurilateral basis with inside or outside the system one can get into. So that's a little bit where we're going. Perhaps I can talk a bit about where we've come from to round out my discussion. I'm going to focus on how security policy and trade policy have interacted. And of course, at the moment, this is getting a lot of attention, but it's not a new phenomenon. We saw after the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, the United States securitized its trade policy there, but it didn't do so via unilateral policy measures. It did so through its regional trading agreements program, and it made a condition of signing a regional trading agreement that a country was a close enough US ally. So that meant your home country, Dimitri, got an FTA, but your neighbors, New Zealand, did not. And so there were, in the old days, essentially, the Americans were still in the business of doing reciprocal trade reform, but it was conditioned by security imperatives. Nowadays, what we're seeing is that the security trade nexus has taken different forms. As far as unilateral policy intervention is concerned, I don't need to remind this audience of the use of the IEEPA tariff, the IEEPA statutes covering, in the case of fentanyl tariffs, 40% of US's imports, and the other trading partners are almost all covered by IEEPA. The only countries which are outside of that are countries which were already in the doghouse as far as the United States was concerned. So the countries like Russia, Cuba, North Korea, and alike. So we essentially have security-related tariffs of different types on most of US imports up until now, unless, of course, you have a nice exception under USMCA. The other tariff, the other security tariff nexus is through Section 232. And here we have 10 ongoing investigations which are still working through the system. Some of these, some of the claims of links to national security from imports are more tenuous than others. But please don't forget that in 1983, the US investigated whether nuts and bolts were a threat to national security as well. So that is not particularly new. The second area I want to emphasize is on export controls. Here we have seen a big shift in policy stance. Between 2015 to 19, on average, there were about 54 or 55 export restrictions or controls put in place every year. From 2020 to 24, that number has risen on average to 291. So a significant increase in the number of, in the resort to export controls, almost always justified on national security grounds or security of supply considerations. And the third area where we see security considerations being important is in selective industrial policy. As you know, we track these selective industrial policy interventions of 70 jurisdictions, and the shift that we've seen in the last year, sorry, in 2025, in the West is extraordinary. So if you look at 2023 and 2024, about 17% of Western industrial policy measures were justified on national security grounds, and another 17% were justified on security of supply grounds. This year, we've seen the percentage of industrial policy measures justified on security of supply grounds go up to 21%, and on national security grounds go up to 31%. So that means that over half of the industrial policy measures recorded in the Western nations this year are motivated by security considerations. The last area, of course, we're seeing trade policy being influenced by security policy, or is in the area of shipbuilding in the United States, where there is a strenuous effort to try and reduce the docking of Chinese-related ships in US ports. Whether that will be successful remains to be seen. So on top of those unilateral measures, we then have joint action through the various agreements with the United States. And here, these seem to fall. The principal measures here seem to be about trying to thin ties with China in sensitive areas such as steel and aluminium. Look at the UK deal. And then we also see other measures to try and thin ties through non-preferential rules of origin, with the goal, where the goal is to really try and stop Chinese factories essentially adding little value and shipping on to the United States. On top of this, we then have secondary sanctions, which of course have been proposed, which could again add a further security dimension to trade policy. And let me just conclude with one last thought. Much of what I've been talking about is how security considerations have influenced trade policy decisions, either unilateral or joint. The other point I would make here is that when one looks at the allies of the United States, because of their defense dependence on the United States, they have in many cases given the United States very generous terms in these agreements. So in that sense, it is the security relationship and the dependence which in turn has driven the negotiations this year. And that I think is a very significant driver which will remain until Europe, Japan and Korea have rearmed sufficiently so as to be able to defend themselves against their respective threats to their national security. So the picture then relating trade and security policy has changed. It's not like the good old days, Dimitri, when these two, trade and security, stayed in different lanes. They're now intertwined in lots of different ways. And I think what I've tried to do here is to lay out to you, or lay out for you in the audience, the many different ways in which trade and security are now interrelated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. And I should say, while I introduced Simon as a professor at IMD, which of course he is, a lot of the use of we there and a lot of the data that Simon is citing comes from his work as the co-founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade, and specifically the Digital Trade Alert and Global Trade Alert suites of products, which are free, quite ridiculously in-depth and sort of available to everyone. I can't recommend them highly enough. I will plug them so Simon doesn't have to, as someone who also suffers from a complete inability to promote himself. I will do that for Simon. One thing that I think I didn't hear Simon say today, but I have heard him say before, is to make the distinction specifically on what is happening between US and China, between the Trump administration, which is, I think, uniquely dominated by the character of the president, and which makes it sometimes difficult to predict where exactly he will fall on the antagonism towards China spectrum on any given morning, versus the long arc of history, which Simon, I have heard you say before, is definitely trending towards geostrategic competition. And one sector where that is playing out and giving no sign of abatement is one that we've got Max Mendez-Para here to talk about, specifically on semiconductors. So I wonder if you could sort of zoom in for us and talk about semiconductors specifically, how some of this is playing out in that sector, and to also step away from, NVIDIA and Intel, and to look at, for those developing countries that are looking to be part and benefit from this technological revolution, what this all means for them.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, specifically, I'm going to be talking about just one heading in the harmonized system, that is 8541. This is a semiconductor chips that is currently the largest traded product across the world. So more than oil now. And they are everywhere. So on everything that we have, there are semiconductors, there are chips, but more important to the discussion, they are also in many of the weapons, such as aircraft, drones, hypersonic missiles, etc. So clearly, this is something extremely critical, where the fragmentation of global trade is very clear there. Definitely, they weren't trading weapons between the US and China before, but this is a big product with significant implications across the value chain. And probably this would be a bit of a longer story than what is currently happening with the US, because it's something that started probably 10 years ago, when the Pentagon realizes that it needed actually to leveraging the US capabilities in robotics, AI, and big data actually to defeat China in this CISID's trap that was mentioned before. And they launched, the Pentagon launched the Defense Innovation Strategy. In 2018, that was taken further notch up by actually in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, when in addition of talking about supporting these industries in the US, then what is enters the restrictions on exports of these technologies into China. And thanks to the Global Trade Alert and the work made by Professor Everett, at the time, and when you start seeing peaking the export restrictions of the US into China and from the world into China, because very importantly, 48% of the restrictions applied on semiconductors, on exports of semiconductors, are applied by other countries at instances of the US that is the proprietor of the technology. So clearly, this started to be a massive issue in the political and in the defense discussions in the US. And you have to be aware that 95% of the global production of semiconductors is in just 5 countries: China, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and I think, and Taiwan, most important. Taiwan is critical here because it's the country that is producing the most, it's the largest producer of semiconductor, and it's the one that is producing the most advanced semiconductors, those under 5 nanometers. Now you don't have to retain that information. This, of course, having 95% of the production of semiconductors, how many? 100 miles away from China was too risky for the US. So by 2022, the Biden administration took the step actually of taking this further and actually start providing subsidies, start providing guarantees to start having that production back into the US. The US produced semiconductors back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but as many things actually they were outsourced to other parts. And that is when it comes the 2022 Chips and Science Act in the US. With massive investments in semiconductors in the US, around $600 billion announced, but some concrete investments like the one from TSMC in Phoenix that are $65 billion of investment. To put in perspective, the total FDI to Africa in 2023 was 53 billion. So this is just one group of investment that is larger than the total FDI to Africa. So continue the restrictions now, not only affecting exports, not only bringing that production back into the US, but also affecting investment. So in 2023, something that started before, the Committee of Foreign Investment in the US actually banned US persons of investing in Chinese located or Chinese owned semiconductor companies, but also of that, the Bureau of Industry and Security in the US actually banned US citizens and US residents also from working in Chinese semiconductors. So you are seeing how this is escalating each time. Not only that, but the US also start blocking providers of technology, of inputs into Chinese companies into exporting into China. The most relevant case is ASML, that is a Dutch company that produces the lithography machines that are to produce the wafers that are using that have the printed circuit. So this escalation, when it comes to Trump, is basically has accelerated, although basically rather than being precise measures adopted in the semiconductors by Trump, basically is more of a sort of threats and measures that are actually continuing with this policy, despite the fact that basically Trump said that they want to get rid of the 2022 Chips and Science Act. But it's moving in the same direction now with actually attracting further investments into the US. So what China have been doing? Well, part of this is a reaction to the 2015 Made in China 2025 plan that was actually trying to develop those industries the semiconductors industry into China. So part of the reaction of China has been actually to basically get a part of this production back into China, and at the same time, by blocking the access of certain rare earth minerals to the US, particularly gallium and germanium that are used in the production of semiconductors, but also other earths that are used in the production of other products in the world. So to end, what are the sort of consequences of this? Well, economically, and we were talking earlier, I mean, there was mention about scale, basically. You are sort of breaking a value chain that was sort of at the lead of the value chain development in the 90s and in the 2000s, where we were talking about the second unbundling around Southeast Asia, around East Asia. It's breaking that. So it's breaking those economies of scale, with not necessarily bringing that into the most efficient producers of semiconductors, that is the US. I mean, there are some information that TSMC is struggling these days actually to achieve the levels of productivities that it had in Taiwan into the US. But clearly it's an issue associated with this aspect related. There is another aspect that this is both the more geopolitical dimension, that is that by doing this, by the US actually taking part of the semiconductors industry that was happily, let's say, located in the east of Asia, is what it's doing is sort of reducing the price for a potential Chinese invasion into Taiwan. Because that industry, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, was what is called the silicon shield for Taiwan. Because as Taiwan exports semiconductors to China, they said, well, we are not going to be attacked by Chinese, invaded by China because of that. So the implications of these measures of the US actually goes beyond the economics, beyond the fragmentation of that, and potentially might bring a significant source of destabilization in a region that many countries, including the UK, have been trying to tilt towards lately. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. I think that's a really good overview of where we are. And I think that first comparison you used to oil really brings it home. I was sort of paralyzed by the idea of mentally rerunning the oil shock and the policies of the oil shock, but substituting if every oil well required $100 billion, 200 patents, and like PhDs, of whom there are like 200 worldwide, locked into permanent contracts to drill, what would the oil shocks of the 80s have looked like, for example? And I think that's sort of, that puts into perspective where we are and gives us a sense of where this might be going. None of it, unfortunately, hugely heartening, as your presentation there relayed. But I wanted to move from this one specific sector, a very important one, to a sort of double question for you, Agnes. Something that we don't get enough on this panel, and I can see at least one representative from the ICC here. So I know that this is a frustration, is a perspective from the business community of beyond the headline figures. What does this feel like when these big geopolitical changes are happening in real time? And then if I could get you to put your other sort of hat on and continue the work that Patrick was doing on the previous panel to talk about some of the impact this is having specifically in Africa.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, and thank you, Jody, Dirk, and everyone else for having me here. My name is Agnes. I represent about 500 businesses that operate in the Eastern African region. And you're right, most of the time when policymakers or politicians meet, most of the times they don't consider or don't think about business, particularly when it comes to trade. Governments don't trade. It is businesses that trade. And for us, the message is quite simple. Businesses, mostly, particularly those who operate in the African continent, can adapt to almost all rules. However, what's most hurtful, what's most challenging is the uncertainty. The constant changing of tariffs, climate measures, the politicization of any agreement becomes very difficult for businesses to deploy capital long term. And that hurts really, and governments and politicians expect businesses to create jobs, to provide opportunities for people to work, but it becomes very difficult for chief executive to constantly keep navigating all these challenges and constantly changing goalposts. From an African perspective, the challenges really, and we had throughout the morning conversation, of lack of a collective or lack of a coordinated approach. Most of us, just like I guess in developed economies, we are driven by national priorities. And those national priorities sometimes do not consider, or sometimes are so pressing that the global perspectives really don't factor. But what a lot of businesses, particularly that chief executive I represent, what they're doing is to constantly ensure that they're informed, they're up to date with the changing direction, the changing government policies. Being part of association, I think it's important that businesses are part of business association so they can access information and support when they have challenges. The other trend that we've noticed, particularly in the African continent, is African government really working closely with the private sector, realizing that as political dynamics or this friendshoring grows, you need the private sector to drive growth. And growth is as important for government as well as for businesses. So seeing government being proactive, having open conversations with businesses to understand what priorities are for them and where they can support them. And also, another trend we've seen is businesses working closely to participate in the public-private partnerships. So that you can understand where governments are aligning with a particular government. So making sure you're closer to government, sometimes it doesn't always work, but closer to government so that you get opportunities wherever they are alignment. But I guess the main message is when policymakers are sitting in Brussels or Washington or London making policies, most times African businesses are not considered. But I'm not here complaining. My call is that African businesses, African policymakers also need to participate or be proactive rather than reactive, because what we've seen is more of a reactive nature, reacting to what the US says, reactive to an example is the UK trade policy, reacting to the EU climate policies, and not understanding where can we support the private sector to be able to participate in global trade. In the region, of course, you're aware of, and we had that conversation, you're aware of the collective initiative, ambition around the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And whereas it's an ambition, and there are some great progress in regards to where we are in terms of the negotiation, the implementation, of course, is still a long way to go. But the beauty of the Africa Free Trade Agreement for me is that there is the political will, but also that the private sector also is driving at that. And that started, particularly, we saw a lot of businesses getting engaged after COVID, realizing the challenges around the supply chains. And so therefore, private sector realizing we can't access some of the products we get from China or the EU. Therefore, we need to see how can we build an infrastructure in the region to be able to ensure that the supply chain is resilient. So we're seeing conversation and also forward thinking by businesses to support governments, guiding them on what policy works for them. But it's still, as I said, it is still we're still a long way. I think working to wait to see what US or what President Trump says, and that's a challenge. I can't understand how just one man can make everyone change. Like I've seen the UK trade policy, a reaction to what the US says, the UK Africa approach. Again, it's a reaction rather than being consistent on what in the long term, what works, how can partnership be long term rather than focus on just one administration. And so it's a challenging time for CEOs who need to create jobs. They cannot plan beyond Trump. About a year ago, we had a program with our members trying to help them understand how not only policies in the US, the China-US crisis, but how the technological advancement will impact businesses. What sort of investment will they need, and how can government support them? And for majority of businesses, one of the response we kept getting was the lack of capital. And I think there's a conversation not only in the African context, but across the globe, lack of capital, lack of access to affordable finance to be able to do business. And in terms of going forward, I can confidently say that a lot of us are not sitting and waiting to see what happens in Washington. A lot of businesses, particularly led by young startups, led by Africans, are moving and participating in the regional economic blocks. They're supporting and adding value to the conversation around what can work. And also we're seeing the confidence. Predominantly we've seen UK and EU businesses investing in the continent. We're seeing a confidence amongst African industrialists, African entrepreneurs also moving across. You're seeing Nigerian businesses investing in East Africa. We're seeing East African businesses investing in South Africa and vice versa. And this is something that we haven't seen, we haven't witnessed in the past. But this confidence, knowing that our markets have great opportunities, and if nobody else, because of this policy, of course, it hinders investment. These trade policies makes it difficult for investors to come to our region. What we're seeing is African businesses doing their own, having the confidence in our own market and putting their money in our continent. And I think that's a positive sign as we wait to see what President Trump or next policy from President Trump.
Thank you so much. I wonder if I could sort of ambush you with a follow-up question on something that you were talking about closer to the start of your remarks, because it's something that's been troubling me a lot, and I get to abuse my role as moderator to make it trouble you as well. You were talking about the partnerships that governments in the region are forming with companies. And that made me think of two sort of contrasting ideas. I once spoke to someone who was building very large-scale sports infrastructure in Russia. And he had said it was the hardest business environment he had ever operated in until it became one day the easiest. And the difference was that someone in Vladimir Putin's office took a direct interest in the stadiums he was building in Sochi, which Putin happens to own half the town. I'm sure that was a coincidence, but there is this notion of sort of direct government involved in that way. And then there was, for the longest time, I think the sort of mood music coming out of neoliberal institutions like the WTO was, hey, that's not the model. The model is not a government working with an individual company to champion its development. What we should be doing is just sort of flat, horizontal, improving the business climate. The World Bank used to literally rank countries based on how good it was. And you step back, you let every company compete in an improving business environment, and you see what happens. I was wondering about your reflections on that kind of dichotomy, and specifically given I suppose, the chaos and the difficulty that we're all experiencing, whether that sort of till the soil and let the tallest flower bloom on its own mentality just doesn't work anymore, or isn't practical in that context.
An example from East Africa, Dimitri, is what we've seen is government identifying champions and working with these champions, not just favoring them, but supporting them so that they can build others. And that, people may say, may not work. Maybe you're favoring. We've seen Elon Musk get all the deals through Trump, but we see who are the champions, say, in the agriculture sector? Who are the champions, say, in the mining sector? And supporting these so that they can help the government come up with policies that build a conducive environment for everybody else to participate. But hearing this voice and contribution from these champions, I think, is most critical. Because in the past, an example from Kenya is politicians decided what worked, and without consulting the businesses and expected businesses to operate in that environment. But yes, and I keep saying, if you've operated, particularly in the Horn of Africa, where I'm from, you can operate in any environment. But we are so interconnected. So whatever happens in Washington has an impact on us. The trade policies, of course, have an impact on our supply chains. But our government, and I don't speak for government, and Her Excellency will speak more about the African government, I think understand the value of partnering with the private sector. I think our government also understand, and this is courtesy of demands from the young people and the citizens, that economic development, participation in the economic activity for everybody is important, and they cannot achieve that without the participation of the private sector. Nigeria is a good case. Aliko Dangote, I'm sure most people in this room would know. Aliko Dangote has been very successful. Why? Because he has had the support of the various administration. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think, Dimitri, I don't know whether I'm digressing, but it is important to have those partnerships because then, in my view, they bring value or information that government can use to build environment for everybody else to operate in.
Thank you. That's tremendously helpful, and it helps sort of shape my own wrestling with this issue, and I hope it's been helpful to the audience as well. And it actually leads us really nicely into my question for Tafika. A lot of us have just come from Geneva, where we sat in about 476 WTO reform panels. But it's sort of taking a half step back on that conversation, one of the long trends in WTO conversations has been going from thinking of the WTO as a passive enabler of development, in a similar way where you sort of create good trading environment and that will lift all boats and hopefully lift LDC and DC boats at a faster proportional rate, to perhaps thinking that the WTO should be playing that the rules should take a proactive approach to supporting development. So I wonder if you could share, and please make it clear what capacity you're speaking in, just as a reminder. If you could make it clear, if you could share with us some of your thoughts leading into the WTO reform conversation at MC14, what's the status of development within that conversation, and what are you sort of foreseeing?
Thank you very much, Dimitri, and happy to have this conversation with you outside of Geneva. Yeah, I'm the Director of Development Division, but definitely I am talking in my personal capacity. And I know that it's a Chatham House rule, so that I can be a bit more frank. But the biggest take that I'll take from this discussion when I go back to my DG is that somebody who worked for ODI for 60 years and had a leading question, and he didn't rule out WTO in the morning session. So it also reminds me of my previous job. I was a diplomat, and once I was sharing my feeling with the former ambassador, said that in the morning, you start work, there are a lot of challenges come on the way, and the evening you think of quitting the job. Then the next day, you wake up and you say that, no, there's something in this job, I must continue. So it's like the similar situation with the WTO, that a lot of members are a bit disillusioned or maybe a bit frustrated. But at the same time, at the end of the day, they realize the value of the rules-based multilateral trading system. And even if all the headwinds that we are facing, we are saying that 70% of world trade still takes place on MFN terms. So that is where the value of the system is providing to global stability of trade. Now, reforms and what are the prospects of development reforms? Reform discussion is not new. And go back to 2019, we had this dispute settlement functions, how to improve the monitoring functions, how to improve the negotiating functions, and discussions have evolved since then. And I can see Simon Evenett, he has hijacked the monitoring function from the WTO. If anybody wants to look at the industrial policy measures or trade security measures, whatever measure you call it, you look at the global trade alert. You do not look at the WTO monitoring report. So there's something that needs to be addressed in the WTO so that the institution stays relevant and more credible for the policymaking people around the world. So now the thing is, like you probably are aware, I'm actually zooming in to the world of WTO. It has a science of its own. It has a sui generis system. We have been talking about, geoeconomics, geopolitics, industrial policy, national security, semiconductor industry. But here, sometimes it's a mundane world of trade, but it still matters for the ecosystem of trade. You know, you have heard probably Ambassador of Norway. He was our former GC chair. He has been appointed as a reform facilitator, Ambassador Olberg. And he is looking at the issue in three tracks. One is called a governance track. Okay, what can we do about the decision-making process? You know, is there an alternative to the consensus-based decision-making in the WTO while we try to agree on things? The second track, you call it a fairness track. Okay, we had S&D provisions in the WTO, how it can be more effective for developing countries, because this has been a long-standing agenda. And the third track is issues of our time. And, you know, Dimitri talked about, you know, JSI on e-commerce. We have a agreement which is trying to be incorporated into WTO architecture, investment facilitation for development. You have work going on for MISMIS. How can WTO embrace these issues, and how can we have a trade rules that we can pass on to new generations? Now, in all this, you also have a development angle. But if you look at the developments in WTO, sometimes things are incremental in nature. Sometimes some of the results will not be a big ticket item, but it's still making a contribution to the system. And you must know that at the last ministerial conference of WTO, we have had a small agreement, but it's still an agreement which applies to all developing countries. And this is about S&D negotiations. And we had a decision which will help developing countries to get some timely help before new standards or regulations are being put in place. Again, you know, it's not necessarily a big decision, but it's a symbolic one, and it tries to help developing countries, you know, integrate into the global system. We talked about LDCs here. It's a special group of developing countries, and WTO members have been responsive to the concerns of these countries. And if you look at WTO decisions, you know, you have duty-free, quota-free market access, rules of origin, services waiver to facilitate their trade in services. And even in the implementation of rules, we had a big part of our WTO is TRIPS, and a group of countries like LDCs are not required to implement that particular pillar of WTO's a flexibility that they will continue until 2034. So development is in action. Now, yes, of course, we can do more, and that is what we are trying to do in the WTO. We are, in addition to negotiations, you have the parallel track where we are trying to improve the deliberations of trade and development discussions in the WTO. And for the last 2-3 years, we have really revamped the agenda. How can we bring issues which leads to the shared understanding of members on certain topics, and which can then facilitate future negotiations? And sometimes things are merely procedural in nature, like, you know, we have a Gulf Cooperation Council Customs Union notification, how it can be discussed in the WTO. You know, we have a group of countries made a proposal that we need to discuss the needs assessment of investment facilitation agreement under the aegis of CTD. It's a plurilateral agreement. CTD is a multilateral forum. How can we make this happen? So all the time we have issues that members are grappling with. But at the end of the day, we are trying to ensure that the concerns of developing country members are addressed, and through that process, that 2/3 of our membership is developing countries, and how can they gain more from the system? Now, there are a few lessons learned, and if you look at the entire gamut of special and differential treatment or development discussions in the WTO, it has always been equated with exemptions from WTO rules. And then members have come to a point that developing countries represent a big group of countries with different levels of development. Is it like, 1995, the kind of flexibilities we agreed upon, we are in 2025, that all, because, it's a question of self-declared developing country status. So whether all developing countries should be given the same flexibility. So that the question of granularity comes in, and that's why the question of evidence-based discussion, yes, members are still willing to help countries, but maybe, we identify the specific challenges and we try to address with some specific solutions. And you will realize that WTO is not only least developed countries have also gone into groups of countries like small economies, groups of countries like landlocked developing countries. So we are looking at the particular vulnerabilities of this group of countries and how can we help them integrate into the system. So I think the question to our members is that how do you design an S&D framework which caters to the needs of the world today, because the world trading system has evolved from the past. So I want to stop here and then come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tawfiq. You get a bespoke round of applause just for you. And I'm sure when you said that Simon had hijacked, what you meant was he had iterated in the free and rules-based marketplace of ideas. I think that was it's a common slip of the tongue. Those two sound very similar. I wanted to sort of close out the panel before we get to Q&A, and please do start formulating your questions for our panelists now with Mona Paulsen. Mona, I think some of the work that I've seen you present that's been most interesting to me is where you have looked at the existing system and kind of taken a half step back and gone, we've been looking at a really narrow set of tools and approaches to try to make the current situation better or to find paths forward, and sort of said, well, okay, but actually there are a lot more tools in the toolbox that are collecting dust. And I know you have a paper on one of those, and I wonder if you could share both sort of the specific idea, but kind of to give a flavor of the variety of methodologies available to members beyond just what we've been using.
So I know Dimitri just prompted me to talk to you about how I can see developing countries pursue collective action, which I'm going to get to, I promise. But I feel the need to first explain how I see where we've gotten to be able to explain why I think collective action, particularly from small open economies, is vital right now. Because some of the things that have been discussed haven't captured how I see it and what motivated me to really want to arm small economies with this opportunity to work together. And the paper is really a legal procedure, a pathway of how to do that without having to propose new mechanisms based on the existing system, based on what was advocated by developing economies in the early era of the gap period in the 1950s and 60s, which still exists. So that's my plug. But I want to sort of engage with some of what has been said in terms of where we see the United States, to appreciate why I think collective action is important, and perhaps also to explain why we haven't seen it yet. So we have had the United States pursue its future-proofing of its status as the major dominant economy since the Second World War. First, its large statecraft instrument was the creation of international organizations designed to oversee the globalized economy. The Bretton Woods institutions, the creation of the International Trade Organization, and the GATT. That was its statecraft tool to create a division between, at the time, the Soviet bloc of economies and the United States as liberal democracies. Over time, we have seen that system continue to legalize and flourish, but within that strong diplomatic technique within what the system was. Now today, and it's not just with Obama, it is within a series through tensions initially with Japan, through the end of the Cold War, we began to see the United States begin to pursue aggressive unilateral actions, right? We were all talking about 301s for a very long time. The interesting thing with the Trump administration this second time around is particularly Agnes's point on uncertainty, on using consistent economic uncertainty to open up a gateway to be able to negotiate and pursue bartering, not deals, not agreements, bartering, to be able to maintain that negotiation, not just for trade access, not just for semiconductors development, but critical mineral rights, into mining, but also to extract the most valuable resource that the United States actually sees, which was teed off a little bit by Simon, which is investment. not investment back in the country that actually has the natural resource, but to ship that, whether logical or not, back to the United States to process, refine, and produce it there. So from my perspective as someone who approaches this, I'm a trade lawyer, but I see this through a historical lens. We can see constant repetition of this desire to prevent those governments that seek to industrialize to instead have that industrialization moved out of their country to maintain their role as a primary producer alone and to have that industrialization occur beyond their borders. And that is not a new story for anyone. The question is what to do about it. We see export controls being strategically designed to be able to try to maintain the rights to those minerals to produce and refine them at home. Indonesia was raised earlier as an important example of that. Indonesia, in defiance of the EU's attempts to bring them to the WTO and contest that, sought to have that industrialization maintained in Indonesia, whether we agree with that policy or not. We also see firms and businesses coming in and trying to gain a better understanding of what that policy uncertainty looks like, and they have a very vital role to play, whether it's through the ICC or whether through other organizations, of trying to discern how to participate in that. The Biden administration's process, why it's different, is that they sought to do it through heavy subsidization, intense subsidization. Just last year, we were all talking, how do we get the same industrial policy? Will it really trickle down to us? The dangerous part of the Trump administration's policy is that they are not trying to do it through a transparent process divided by their government through checks and balances. It is a far more opaque process where governments in closed-door negotiations, where sometimes we don't even see the outcome of these agreements or deals, I'm not sure, framework, whatever we want to call them, that is an entirely opaque process where we have no consideration of what is happening, but we then see very key economies in this future-proofing of the fourth industrial revolution coming out with extraordinary large investment pledges. So we talked about 43 billion to Africa. Japan has committed 550 billion in the United States. And to Agnes's point about what we understand about businesses being able to know what is happening, we have no knowledge. We don't know what Japan is committed to. We don't know if they will have any oversight. Are they just simply loaning this money to existing US firms? Are they not? Can a foreign firm, can a Korean firm receive that funding if they're building in the United States? Can they not? Can a Chinese firm? We don't know. So this is the place of economic uncertainty to which all of your businesses have to operate. And in terms of then what that means for African development, for Japanese development, for Indian development, we don't know. And it requires, this entire Trump administration process is hinged upon all governments bartering bilaterally, because that's the only way it works, is you pick off each government to think that they are alone, because that's how the deal works best. Because if you participate in the multilateral system, if you participate in a plurilateral agreement, you must speak to your partners. There is an obligation within the WTO for Article 28 procedures. No one was telling the United States they couldn't overhaul their tariff strategy. They can. But there were requirements that they respond and come to an agreement with other governments so that they talk to their producers, to their firms, and are able to understand how to address that change in the tariff bargaining. If that doesn't happen, you can go to the White House and have a negotiation. And it's interesting to hear Agnes talk about the importance of national champions, because if you flip that out of a country that is trying to develop and participate in the globalized economy, and you put it into the context of the United States, a firm having to go have a direct link to Secretary of Commerce or to USTR Rep Greer or to the president himself, who is overseeing this authority. Interesting that Simon was talking about the role of IEEPA. This is requiring the US to maintain a perpetual, never-ending state of exceptional emergency, because if they don't maintain that, There is no reason to take that authority that otherwise belongs to USTR to negotiate trade agreements. Because that's how it works. So there will be no end to the exceptional emergency so long as everything is needed to maintain that emergency to continue this new way of making deals. So Dimitri told me, whatever you do, Mona, you can't just say, now I'm going to talk about collective action and then not explain the details of it. And I'm out of time. But I really want to maintain that it's in that context. It's not just about understanding different scenarios. It's that all of them will exist. It's Schrodinger's cat. They will all exist until we take it out of the box and we know if the cat is dead or alive. That was a Big Bang. If any of us watched, I know everyone's watched Big Bang because they explained it in that, but I won't get into it further in that theory. Situation complaints, I'm going to give it 30 seconds, but please ask me a question and then I'll turn to it. Julio Lacarte, who was the Uruguayan ambassador at the time, went up at the beginning in late 1950s and said, this whole GATT benefits that you promised us as a developing economy, we have not seen. And they raised a situation complaint, which was not targeting a specific government. And they said, we need to talk about this uncertainty that we have in our system. Didn't go very far. I go through it in my paper. But the Brazilians then said, wait a minute. Oh yeah, there is another type of complaint other than violation or non-violation. We need to work with this. And as they were developing the special and differential treatment, part 4, the new era of development dimension in the GATT, the Brazilians and the Uruguayans worked together and said, we need collective enforcement for developing economies. Individually, we're a mosquito bite. Together, we are a force to be reckoned with. And they tried to propose it, and there was a series of negotiations. And it is in that process that they said, it's already there. We already have Article 25 of the GATT that promotes joint action to further the objectives of this agreement. And it is within then the paper I talk about how situation complaints could work. But in my 30 seconds, Dimitri said you have to explain what panels do in the context of a situation complaint. You do not try to induce the United States back into compliance. It won't happen for all the reasons I just said. But you can have a situation complaint amongst those governments that think they need to work together to protect these industries. And you say, we are dealing with a situation of global economic uncertainty. Pursuant to these rules, we need a panel to issue recommendations to offer special procedures for addressing the harm that is caused to our economies and attenuate that, whether it is trade that is diverted from an outside in, an external consequence, to address the fact that there is a gap in the rules and we need better clarification from the panel, special procedures or a mechanism to address that, whether we need now to agree amongst ourselves to added notifications with respect to new subsidization or addressing safeguard mechanisms that are not necessarily hinging on a causal requirement of unforeseen developments. So you work within them. You're not trying to make a new agreement, a new plurilateral initiative. You are acknowledging for a discrete situation, you have this exception. Could you use waivers? Absolutely. But a waiver is still necessarily an indefinite question. How do you identify this exceptional circumstance? With an independent, neutral panel offering those recommendations, it is at least an important safety valve to dealing with the kinds of economic uncertainty that firms are dealing with right now and trying to bring in that cooperation that can hopefully help. Could it exist without a situation complaint? Yes, and I go into that in the paper as well. But the benefit of the situation complaint is that they're coming together and saying, we need to work together to deal with this in the same way that you think about how a dispute is brought to the WTO. But it is in another situation, recognizing that it's not about rule violation or not. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. Before we let you go, what is the name of your paper?
Oh, the WTO case for collective action. And it's coming out, I'm sorry. It has been, I should have started this. So Dan Syriac, who is a trade economist, I'm Canadian. No, when I hear Fortress America, I just cringe as a Canadian in thinking about this. But it is the case for the WTO case for collective action. It's coming out in World Trade Review in about 4 weeks.
Thank you.
And you can just, I can give it to you right now.
So the benefit of first mover advantage. Thank you so much.
It's online as well, so.
Thank you so much, Mona, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's now my pleasure to open up the floor to questions, both in person and online. I can see hands going up already. If you have questions online, I think we're asking you to put them in the chat and I will get them delivered to me. When you ask your question, please do introduce yourself and let us know which panelist you'd like to speak to. Let me start with you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. I really want to go back to the idea of large companies versus small, which has been on the edges of several presentations. I think it's much more important than many of the other issues which we've discussed, because an international rules-based system doesn't just protect small countries against large, it protects small companies against large. And what we're seeing in the US is a 19th century large companies dominating the trade policy. The only hope is that Trump doesn't entirely agree with the large companies, so it's not clear who's going to come out on top. But assuming it's the large companies, which in the end, as someone who studied foreign investment for longer than I care to remember, usually happens, I think that's important. And it's not just in the US. The one thing you learn if you're looking at foreign investors is that the rules don't only apply to small people, to coin a phrase. Foreign investors have never worried terribly about the rules for foreign investment or for tariffs. They make their deals, and in the same way that they're being made now. And what really worries me is that the only thing that has protected the system against this for the last 30 or 40 years is the WTO rules to which people have at least paid lip service. That is no longer happening. There is no defense now in any country against its large companies. And I'm very worried that most of the deals that are going to be done are not going to be done by coalitions of developing countries. They'll be done by coalitions, or if you prefer, cartels of large companies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I might take another question while our panelists think about how to formulate that one. Anyone you like.
Thanks very much, Graham Butler from Chatham House. Really great panel. I had a question about the investment flows that were highlighted by several panelists. So these, in some cases, are being committed by market economies. I mean, Japan, Switzerland, various others, EU. But I don't see how, that's meaningful, because they're market economies. They can't tell their companies what to do. Now, some in the US must know that. They certainly know it. So what's the meaning of all this? I mean, is it things that companies choose to do anyway? Or, what is the additionality of this? And then there is a question about what's the macro effect of that more broadly. Thank you.
I'll take one more and then we'll throw it to our panelists. Sure.
Hi, thank you. My name is Achyut Anil. I'm a legal researcher at CITP University of Sussex. Previously, I was a negotiator with the Government of India, but my question essentially is specifically with respect to this concept of security, economic security, because to me, it's just protectionism by any other name. And we are just giving it a veneer of credibility by saying that there is a security argument for it. Because I'll just give you an example. 5, 6, 7 years apart. So India solar case, IRA. Exact same circumstances. India had to dismantle its entire industry. India had to dismantle its subsidy regime. Their entire industry collapsed, and it's filled with Chinese imports right now. And IRA, which is essentially now perfectly fine. Nobody's really talking about it. So I have a slightly left field question regarding this. If security is now going to be used for justifying any sort of industrial policy, why can't just developing countries push off all sorts of industrial policy as economic security? Because they can pass it off and it's a very legitimate developmental objective as for security. So why can't you do that when developed countries can do it for what I consider trivial reasons? Why can't developing countries do that for actually developing to reach that level?
Thank you. Since you all ignored my request to pick a panelist, I'm going to do it. And the panelists can suffer along with me. So I thought we could throw the sort of reflections on small versus major companies to you, Agnes, and then just to give people time to think. Mona, if you could tackle what is the status of investment commitments by governments that absolutely cannot make investment commitments
Yeah.
question. And then maybe David, as sort of from the geostrategy lens, the final question of why doesn't Burkina Faso just decide that the rules don't apply because it's in its national security interest?
Should I go back to Dimitri?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that question. And SMEs and small businesses is a topic I'm very, very passionate about. Like everybody else, I wrote a paper on the trade finance gap amongst the SMEs. It's a conversation, and I keep referring to the government. It's a conversation a lot of our governments, and I'm sure Your Excellency you'll agree with me, given that a majority of African businesses are in the SME sector. I think it's a lack of how do you bring them on board? How do you support them? One of the answer that keeps coming is providing them with the tools they require to be able to participate in the business environment. One of those is finance. Access to finance for a lot of businesses in the continent is such a challenge. It's very expensive, and they're crowded out of the commercial market by governments who are desperately also borrowing. Also, as you know, it's very difficult for governments also to access development of finance. So how do you ensure that they're not crowded out by the large corporations? One of the recommendations for me is how can large corporations work with these SMEs to make sure they're in their supply chains? And apart from just being in their supply chains and supplying to them, how can they support them with capacity, right? Empower them through information and facilitating. I represent, unfortunately, most of the East African Association members will be some of the largest companies in the region who are listed in our stock exchanges. But I completely understand, and it's a conversation we constantly try and address. I think one for me, from my own perspective, is providing the tools they require to be able to do business. And one of those is finance. Give them money and teach them how to use money, and they'll be able to. I don't know whether you agree with me, Mona, but that would be the only thing. But also, as I say, national champions, I think it's important to select a group that you can work with, and of course, being very transparent. But also, even as you're selecting the big corporation, select SMEs too. Bring them in the negotiation table. Let them explain to you what areas, because they know better how they can address their challenges. Bring them on board and see how it works. But I think it's a collaboration. I like the word partnership. The large corporation working closely with the SMEs, ensuring that they are empowered or they're part of their supply chains.
Thank you.
I see you shaking your head. I don't think you agree with me. I'm sure you.
Mona, did you want to take the investment question?
Yeah. I don't agree with you that investment law is irrelevant. And I know that because I'm about to teach international investment law and arbitration next week. And firms are very, very good at understanding what protections they have under international treaties and the routes they have to arbitration. And I think also in terms of understanding David's jab at me, his joke was like, I'm going to tell you that international law is not relevant. It's totally relevant depending on how you use it. Law is still structuring these contracts, still structuring these concessions. In terms of understanding how small to large firms use it, political risk insurance remains a huge benefit to understanding how to invest abroad. And if you look at what, the US XIM is doing in terms of the funding that they're giving to specific projects, I advise all of you to go and examine what they require in terms of projects specifically in one of their transformational sectors. Under the Biden administration, it was really, really simple. You couldn't have anything touch China. Now with the Trump administration, it's changing a little bit in terms of how they foresee it. But that is a huge question that we haven't yet talked about in terms of what does it require businesses that want to invest either in the United States or in a particular strategic, what is considered strategic or critical mineral or input, what that means. It is really interesting to see the burdens that are imposed on firms right now. Is it going to require defense official sitting in your boardroom, asking that private firm to make calculations that are not profit promoted or invested, but are defense related? When we talk about having firms to have to understand how to operate in these new geopolitical contexts, what do we really mean by that? Because what we're seeing the United States do is a really old playbook that 30 years ago, they would have absolutely told any developing economy, you're about to be lowered on the World Bank doing business ranking if you require that for us. Really easy examples, screening. Another really big example, telling officials that, oh, if you have something that our particular government is interested in, we can help you facilitate your permitting and licensing permits. They would have said that's according the domestic firm better treatment than the foreign. So all of these strategies that were used, we don't understand fully how that will operate. We see a little bit of, dare I say, it's under Chatham House rules, right? Hypocrisy in terms of understanding that. For these investment pledges, Grian, it's supposed to be loans or loan guarantees, but we don't know what that means in particular for Japanese firms, for example, because we only have the memorandum of understanding for Japan. So that's sort of the framework for it. So I don't think it's the same situation as something bypassing CFIUS, in terms of US Steel and a procurement from a Japanese company. It would be from the Japanese government providing loan. But if we tie that with Agnes's point about the value of, funding your own businesses to allow them to grow, our pockets, or not my pocket, I have no money, but the government's pockets are allocated in a very particular way. And so if they're funding development abroad, then where will the money come to fund the SMEs and firms at home? And this is the question. Now, for Japan, they may say, we already had 600 billion ready to go to fund in the US. We want to be on the edge of that. So we're happy. We get some better treatment. They have the state, so far, the Commerce Department has put out this investment accelerator, which is essentially investment facilitation. It's with lofty commitments of, we will help you fast track your regulatory permits. We will, we don't know what that means for environmental externalities or for communities that may not want a new mine in their backyard. We don't know. But we do know that this kind of acceleration, this benefits are a part of that process, supposedly for Japanese firms, but we don't know what the defense commitments will be from that. But we do know this, the Trump administration, particularly the president of the United States, wants to be at the top of that food chain to determine which projects go through. And that's very clear, at least in the memorandum of understanding. So we're not talking about national champions in that it might be the best firm to promote the development of the United States, but a sort of a more opaque process where we don't know. And then the last point on India solar sales, I always tell my students, this was in 2016. If this dispute had come up in 2020 after COVID, for India to say, we think our international supply, the international supply of solar cells and modules is fraught with geopolitical problems and uncertainty, we must foster our own domestic supply. I don't think everyone would have understood that. But at the time the dispute came down, obviously we know that the appellate body said, oh, you have to consider the entire international supply, not just domestic supply for essential short supply, right? So it's amazing how just within 10 years, you see such a change in perspective. I've talked too much. I'm done.
Thank you, Mona. I would just add really briefly on the investment question. One of the key things is this is all completely new ground, and each one of these is bespoke. Japan appears to have a weird US-directed mechanism. The EU, I think, just hopes that the EU just hopes existing investment flows somehow count, and the Korean government is in the process of having an existential crisis as it contemplates what this means. So you do have to take these one at a time. David, did you want to say a brief comment on?
Yeah, just quickly on economic security. Look, for my view, economic security can't be national security, but if so, there's an exception, which means that you've just broken the entire WTO, in effect, in quick form. Therefore, given that we're not just about to break the WTO, but economic security is something we haven't sort of seen before. That's my point of an open economy. It is reasonable to say if an economy does have a 90% dependency on a single supplier, for example, that country should be able to do something about it. And that, this is tricky to say, but MFN may have to not apply in this situation. I'm sorry, the Timu and Shein is a perfect example. should MFN be applying to Temu and Shein? I think that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. For immediate thing to do, we're not going to get an agreement on this. The immediate thing to do is to actually start with the notification kind of functions and actually say, look, what is economic security? Are we notifying these measures? Are we actually understanding them? And then move on from there to, okay, what could we actually do about this? But that's a very quick answer because we're running out of time.
Thank you so much, David. We are running pretty low on time, and I want to make sure we give at least a little bit of a final word to Max, Simon, and Tawfik. So I thought maybe I will then pose an open question to the three of you to let us wrap up this panel. We have a lot of people here who are focusing on trade policy. Some of them have been focusing on for their entire career. Some of them are really tuning in now as the situation slightly melts down. Over the next sort of year and a half, what are the bellwethers that you are looking at to determine where this is all going? And what do you think perhaps are the key questions or key moments as David and Mona attempt to perfect a high five that I'm really hoping we have footage of to play at their retirement parties. Simon, would you mind if I started with you?
Sure. So look, one key moment will be in January of next year when the CBAM comes into place and to what type of pushback we're going to get from that. Another key moment will come when the United States decides whether or not to put additional tariffs on countries which have digital taxes, digital regulations, which it does not like. And a third key moment will come when the decision is made about secondary sanctions vis-a-vis China and India and their purchases of oil. So we've got plenty to look forward to as we see the trading system barrel forward. The one thing which I do not expect to see much happen is on WTO reform at MC14. I think we will continue to talk and talk and talk so long as this process remains Geneva-based. Thank you.
Particularly proud to be head of the Geneva Trade Platform after that intervention. Thank you, Simon. Max, did you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I think that Simon said it very, very well. I think that probably would be very interesting to know more now from the politics is what is the outcome of the midterm elections in the US. Not because that necessarily might mean that some of the things in case of a bad result for Trump actually going to reverse some of the tariff or measures. I think that the tariff program are going to stay in the US for a while. Now they are generating very good revenue. But I think that eventually, whatever is happening in the domestic in the US might potentially sort of set up the tone of what would be the future policies. I am not saying that they're going to reverse. I mean, there is a possibility that actually many of the things actually get more radicalized, and that is a significant risk. But I think that are the sort of thing to look in more on the politics, on the politics side.
Thank you, Max. And to close us out, Tawfik, what are you looking at? What should we
say to Simon that you see, talking is in the DNA of WTO because, how people interpreted GATT, General Agreement on Talk and Talk. So, but I must say that, we are really approaching MC14, as Simon has mentioned, and I think that's the key kind of a focus of members is somehow called as a reform ministerial. There's only two things that WTO members and maybe other stakeholders should focus on, that what is it that working well today and that we can preserve? And the second question is that, yes, what is it that it's not working at all and we need to improve on, and what can we agree on as a member, as a common denominator? So I think that's going to be a ministerial which will define the work going forward, and hopefully that, we will be able to strengthen the system going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. We could give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. And thank you to ODI for organizing and for having us. Jody.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Thank you.